The hull of the San Felipe listed hard to starboard as cannon smoke drifted across her shattered deck, and in that choking grey veil, Captain Rodrigo Escarra saw the flag that would haunt the Caribbean for 7 blood-soaked years. It flew from the mainmast of the brigantine, bearing down upon them not the black banner of common sea-wolves, but a crimson pennant that seemed to drink the dying sunlight, emblazoned with a white skeleton, clutching an hourglass in one bony hand and a cutlass in the other. The Scarlet Pirate had come. If you felt the pull of the sea and the weight of legends, leave a word below with your port of call. Escarra had heard whispers of this raider in the taverns of Havana and Cartagena, spoken in the trembling voices of sailors who had survived encounters with the devil himself. They said the man who flew that crimson flag showed no mercy to those who resisted, that he painted his decks with Spanish blood and left burning wrecks to drift as warnings upon the trade routes between Veracruz and Cadiz. They said his crew numbered near 100 souls, most of them English rogues and French buccaneers who had turned from privateering to outright piracy when the War of the Spanish Succession ended and left them without letters of mark or coin. They said he took his name not from the colour of his flag alone, but from the scarlet coat he wore into battle, a nobleman's garment stolen from some murdered hidalgo, its fine fabric now stained, darker still. The year was 1718, and the Caribbean had become a cauldron of violence. Nassau, in the Bahamas, sheltered the Republic of Pirates, a lawless stronghold where men like Benjamin Hornigold and Charles Vane ruled without crown or code save what they wrote themselves. The routes between the Sugar Islands and the mainland swarmed with predators who had learned their craft in naval service and now turned it against the very empire that had trained them. Merchant vessels sailed in fear, and coastal settlements posted lookouts day and night, knowing that a crimson flag upon the horizon meant rape, plunder, and death. The Scarlet Pirate's true name was recorded in no ledger and sworn to in no deposition, though some claimed he had once been an officer aboard a Royal Navy frigate, cashiered for cruelty and left to rot in Port Royal before the great earthquake of 1692 freed him from his chains. Others whispered he was a Portuguese corsair who had sailed the pirate round to Madagascar and returned with enough plundered diamonds to buy a ship and crew of his own. What mattered was not who he had been, but what he had become. A name spoken with dread from Barbados to the Gulf of Mexico, a shadow that moved with the trade winds and left only wreckage in its wake. His ship, the Venganza, was a swift brigantine of Dutch build, refitted with 18 guns and crewed by men who knew that failure meant the noose and success meant silver enough to drown in rum. She carried no cargo save weapons and plunder, her hold stuffed with casks of gunpowder, spare sailcloth, salt pork, and the accumulated wealth of a dozen raids. Her deck bore the dark stains of violence that no amount of seawater could scour clean, and her timbers creaked with the weight of secrets. Muttered prayers, screamed curses, and the wet sound of steel parting flesh. The crew of the Venganza lived by articles written in the captain's own hand and sworn upon a bloodied cutlass. Every man received an equal share of plunder save for the captain, who took 2, and the quartermaster and sailing master who took 1.5. Disputes were settled by vote or pistol, depending on their severity, and cowardice in battle was punishable by marooning. No man could strike another aboard ship without settling the matter ashore. No man could gamble with cards or dice for money. No man could keep a woman aboard without the crew's consent. And above all, no man could betray the crimson flag, for that flag was their bond, their banner, and their promise of blood. Yet even among pirates, loyalty is a currency debased by greed, and fear can turn brother against brother when the gallows looms near enough to smell the tarred rope. The Scarlet Pirate ruled his crew through terror as much as plunder, and though his men followed him into the mouths of cannons and the hearts of fortified ports, They whispered among themselves in the darkness below decks, wondering how long their luck could hold and whether their captain's madness would drag them all to hell. The raid on Portobello in June of that year had proven especially brutal. The Venganza had joined with two other pirate vessels, a sloop commanded by an Irishman named Quinn and a captured Spanish merchantman refitted as a raider, and together they had descended upon the Panamanian port like wolves upon a sheepfold. The town's fortifications, undermanned and crumbling from the humid heat, had offered little resistance after the pirates landed a shore party and spiked the coastal guns. For 2 days, the raiders had moved through Portobello like a plague, looting warehouses, ransacking churches, and dragging the governor from his palace to demand ransom for the town itself. The Scarlet Pirate had overseen the torture personally, standing in his crimson coat beneath the shade of a palm while his men heated cutlass blades in braziers and applied them to the governor's feet. The screams had echoed across the plaza, and the ransom, 8,000 pieces of 8 in silver and gold, had been delivered by the town's terrified merchants within hours. But the pirate had taken the money and burned the governor's palace anyway, laughing as the flames consumed the Spanish standard that had flown above it. It was after Portobello that the rot began to spread through the crew like weevils through ship's biscuit. A sailing master named Graves, an Englishman from Bristol who had served aboard privateers during the war, began to speak in low tones with the quartermaster, a Frenchman called Belmont. They spoke of the increasing danger, of the colonial governors who were hardening their defences, and the Royal Navy ships that now hunted pirates with the same determination once reserved for the Spanish. They spoke of Woodes Rogers, the former privateer turned pirate hunter who had arrived in Nassau with a king's pardon for those who would renounce piracy and a noose for those who would not. And they spoke of the Scarlet Pirate's growing recklessness, his refusal to divide the Portobello plunder equally, his insistence on ever more dangerous raids. The whispers grew louder when the Venganza encountered a Royal Navy patrol sloop off the coast of Jamaica in August. The pirate ship should have fled. She was faster and could outrun most naval vessels in open water, but the Scarlet Pirate ordered his crew to raise the crimson flag and engage. The battle lasted 3 hours, a brutal exchange of broadsides that left the Venganza with 12 dead and her mainmast splintered, while the naval sloop limped away toward Port Royal with her colours still flying. It was a Pyrrhic victory at best, and it cost the pirates more than blood. It cost them the illusion of invincibility. Graves and Belmont approached the captain that night as the Venganza lay at anchor in a hidden cove along the Honduran coast, her crew working by lantern light to repair the damaged rigging. They found him in his cabin, seated before a chart table littered with maps and a half-empty bottle of rum. The crimson coat hung upon a peg like a shed skin. The two men spoke carefully, proposing that the crew take the plunder they had accumulated and sail for the French settlements on Hispaniola, where they might divide the spoils and retire from the pirate's life before their luck ran dry. The Scarlet Pirate listened in silence, his face shadowed and unreadable in the candlelight, and then he rose and drew a pistol from his belt. "The crimson flag flies until I say otherwise," he said, his voice low and cold as deep water. "Any man who speaks of surrender or retirement again will decorate the yardarm." Graves and Belmont retreated, but the seed had been planted, and it would grow in darkness like a poisonous flower. The crew began to divide into factions, those who still feared and followed the Scarlet Pirate, and those who believed the time had come to cut their losses and flee before the noose found them. The division was never spoken aloud, but it lived in the sidelong glances and the hands that rested too casually upon knife hilts when the captain passed. In September, the Venganza raided a convoy of 3 merchant ships sailing from Santiago de Cuba toward Spain. The attack went poorly from the start. One of the merchantmen was armed with more guns than expected, and her crew fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender to pirates meant torture and likely death. The battle raged for most of a day, and when the smoke finally cleared, the Venganza had taken 2 of the 3 ships, but at a cost of 18 men dead and twice that number wounded. Among the dead was Belmont, the quartermaster, killed by grape shot that had torn through his chest and left him bleeding out upon the deck while he cursed the crimson flag with his final breath. The crew elected a new quartermaster, a Welsh gunner named Thomas ap Morgan, who had sailed with the buccaneer Henry Morgan in his youth and carried the old pirate's ruthlessness in his veins. Morgan was loyal to the Scarlet Pirate, or so it seemed, and his election was meant to restore order to the fractured crew. But Graves remained, brooding and watchful, and he was not alone in his doubts. The final act of betrayal began not with a mutiny, but with a letter. In October, when the Venganza put in at a deserted quay off the coast of Nicaragua to careen her hull and scrape away the barnacles that slowed her passage, Graves slipped away from the camp and made his way to the nearest Spanish settlement. There, he sought audience with the colonial authorities and offered them a proposition. In exchange for a full pardon and a reward of 500 pieces of eight, he would deliver the Scarlet Pirate into their hands. The Spanish, who had suffered more than any nation from the pirates' depredations, agreed readily. They provided Graves with a letter of safe conduct and a promise that any man of the Venganza's crew who assisted in the capture of their captain would receive clemency and a share of the reward. Graves returned to the quay, the letter hidden in his boot, and began to recruit others to his cause. He found willing conspirators among those who had lost friends in the recent battles, among those who feared the growing attention of naval patrols, and among those who simply wanted their share of plunder before it was too late. The plan was simple. When the Venganza next engaged a target, Graves and his fellow conspirators would seize the crimson flag from the mainmast and strike it, signaling to any pursuing ships that the crew had surrendered. In the confusion, they would overpower the Scarlet Pirate and bind him for delivery to the Spanish authorities. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had become the crew's constant companion, and they were willing to stake their lives on it. The opportunity came in late October, when the Venganza sighted a Spanish treasure galleon sailing alone off the coast of Veracruz. The galleon was heavily laden, riding low in the water, and the Scarlet Pirate ordered his crew to give chase with all the hunger of a starving wolf. The Venganza closed rapidly, her guns run out, and her crew preparing to board, and the crimson flag snapped in the wind like a blood-stained promise. But as the pirate ship drew alongside the galleon and the first grappling hooks flew, Graves made his move. He and 6 other conspirators rushed the mainmast, cutlasses drawn, and fought their way through the men stationed there. They cut the halyards and hauled down the crimson flag, then raised in its place a white pennant torn from a spare sail, a signal of surrender that no naval captain could mistake. The Scarlet Pirate saw the white flag rise and understood instantly what had happened. He turned from the rail where he had been shouting orders for the boarding party and drew both his pistols, firing into the knot of mutineers at the mainmast. One shot took Graves in the shoulder, spinning him around, but the sailing master kept his feet and raised his own pistol. The 2 men fired simultaneously, and the captain staggered backward as the ball struck him in the chest, punching through the scarlet coat and into the flesh beneath. The deck erupted into chaos as the crew realized what was happening. Some men rushed to their captain's side while others joined the mutineers, and within moments the Venganza was engulfed in a savage close-quarters battle. Men fought with cutlasses and boarding pikes, pistols and belaying pins, and the deck grew slick with blood that mixed with the seawater sloshing in the scuppers. The Spanish galleon, seeing the white flag, and then the confusion aboard the pirate ship, sheered away and made for open water, leaving the Venganza to tear itself apart. The Scarlet Pirate, bleeding but not yet dead, dragged himself to the quarterdeck and seized the ship's wheel. With one hand pressed to the wound in his chest, he steered the Venganza toward the shore, intending to beach her and escape into the jungle. But Graves and his men reached him before he could complete the maneuver, and they hauled him away from the wheel while he fought like a cornered beast, striking out with the bloodied cutlass he had drawn from his belt. Thomas ap Morgan, the new quartermaster, appeared through the smoke and chaos with a dozen loyal men at his back. He raised a musket and fired, and Graves fell with a ball through his skull. The mutiny collapsed as quickly as it had begun, the conspirators killed or captured, and the loyal crew regained control of the ship. But the damage had been done. The Scarlet Pirate lay upon the quarterdeck, with his lifeblood pooling beneath him, and the crimson flag lay crumpled and torn at the base of the mainmast. Morgan knelt beside his captain and tried to staunch the wound, but they both knew it was mortal. The ball had pierced a lung, and every breath brought a froth of pink foam to the pirate's lips. He gripped Morgan's arm with a hand that had lost its strength, and spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. "Raise the flag," he said. "Let them see it one last time." Morgan retrieved the crimson pennant and climbed the mainmast himself, lashing it to the halyard with shaking hands. The flag rose slowly, its white skeleton stark against the blood-red field, and it snapped in the breeze as the sun dipped toward the western horizon. The Scarlet Pirate watched it rise, and then his eyes closed and his breathing ceased, and the man who had terrorized the Caribbean for 7 years became just another corpse upon a pirate's deck. The crew of the Venganza buried him at sea that night, sewing his body into a length of sailcloth weighted with cannonballs. They spoke no prayers and sang no hymns, for pirates do not mourn as Christian men do, but they stood in silence as the body slipped beneath the waves and disappeared into the darkness. And then they divided his possessions according to the articles: his pistols and cutlass, his charts and instruments, and the scarlet coat that had given him his name. But the crimson flag they did not divide. Morgan took it down from the mainmast and locked it in the captain's sea chest, for none of the crew wished to fly it again. It had become a cursed thing, a symbol of betrayal as much as terror, and to raise it would invite the same fate that had befallen its master. The Venganza sailed on under a plain black flag, just another pirate ship among the dozens that haunted the Caribbean, and the name of the Scarlet Pirate passed into legend. In the years that followed, rumors circulated through the ports and taverns of the Spanish Main. Some said that the crimson flag had been stolen from the Venganza by a member of the crew who sold it to a collector in Havana for a handful of gold coins. Others claimed that Morgan had buried it on a deserted island along with the captain's share of plunder, marking the spot with a crude cross carved into a palm tree. And a few whispered that the flag had never been taken down at all, that it still flew from the mainmast of a ghost ship that appeared on moonless nights, crewed by the restless dead who sought vengeance against those who had betrayed them. The truth, as truths often are in the Caribbean, was both simpler and stranger. The crimson flag remained locked in the sea chest for 3 more years, while the Venganza continued to raid and plunder under Morgan's command. But in 1721, the ship was finally cornered by a Royal Navy frigate off the coast of Jamaica and forced to surrender after a running battle that lasted most of a day. The crew was taken in chains to Port Royal, where they were tried for piracy and hanged at Gallows Point, their bodies left to swing in the tropical sun until the flesh rotted and fell away. The Venganza itself was condemned and sold at auction, her hull refitted as a merchant vessel and her guns removed. But before the ship changed hands, the authorities opened the sea chest in the captain's cabin and found the crimson flag folded within, still stained with the blood of the man who had died beneath it. They brought it forth as evidence at the trial, and the surviving pirates flinched when they saw it, as if the mere sight of that scarlet cloth could condemn them more surely than any testimony. After the trial, the flag was taken to the residence of the colonial governor, where it was displayed as a trophy alongside other captured pirate colors. Visitors to the governor's mansion would stop before it and listen to the story of the Scarlet Pirate and his crimson banner, and some would shake their heads and murmur that such wickedness could only end in blood and betrayal. But the flag itself said nothing, hanging limp and silent in the still air, a relic of a brutal age that was slowly passing into memory. Years later, after the governor had died and his mansion had been sold to pay his debts, the crimson flag disappeared. No record was made of its fate. It simply vanished, as so many things vanish in the islands where the sea and the jungle conspire to erase the works of men. Perhaps it was destroyed, burned, or thrown into the harbor to sink and rot among the bones of ships and sailors. Perhaps it was stolen, taken by some collector of morbid curiosities who wished to own a piece of pirate history. Or perhaps it found its way back to the sea, carried by some descendant of the Venganza's crew who believed the old superstitions about cursed flags and wished to lay the ghost of the Scarlet Pirate to rest. But on certain nights, when the wind blows hard from the northeast and the waves crash white upon the reefs, sailors still speak of seeing a crimson flag flying from the mast of a ship that appears and vanishes like smoke upon the water. They say it sails the same routes the Venganza once haunted, from the Windward Passage to the Gulf of Honduras, and that any vessel unlucky enough to sight it will be cursed with foul winds and empty holds. They say the ghost of the Scarlet Pirate stands upon the quarterdeck in his blood-stained coat, steering his phantom ship through the darkness, and that he is searching for the men who betrayed him, though all those men are long dead, and their bones scattered across the Caribbean floor. The tavern keepers and chandlers of Port Royal and Cartagena will tell you these stories if you buy them enough rum, and they will point to the old logbooks and depositions that mention the crimson flag and the pirate who flew it. But they will also tell you that such tales are merely the inventions of superstitious sailors, the kind of legends that grow like barnacles upon the hull of history until the truth is buried beneath layers of embellishment and fear. What is certain is this. In the summer of 1718, a pirate known only by the color of his flag raided the shipping lanes of the Caribbean with uncommon ferocity, and in the autumn of that year he was betrayed by his own crew and killed upon the deck of his ship. What is certain is that his flag, which had struck terror into the hearts of merchant sailors and coastal settlers alike, became the instrument of his downfall when his men tore it down and raised the white pennant of surrender. And what is certain is that the crimson flag, like the man who flew it, passed into legend, a warning to all who would rule by fear, that fear itself can turn and bite like a wounded serpent. The sea keeps its secrets, and the wind carries its stories, and somewhere in the depths where the sunlight fades to black, the bones of the Scarlet Pirate rest among the wreckage of 1,000 ships, and if you listen closely on a quiet night, some say you can still hear the crack of canvas and the creak of rigging, and see a flash of crimson upon the horizon, bright as fresh blood against the darkness. In a small museum in Havana, behind glass in a climate-controlled case, there hangs a fragment of red silk no larger than a man's hand. The curator's card identifies it as a piece of a pirate flag, recovered from an unnamed wreck off the coast of Cuba in 1893. The silk is faded now, its crimson dulled to rust, but if you look closely, you can still make out the stitching that once formed the outline of a skeleton's hand. No one knows for certain if this scrap belonged to the Scarlet Pirate's banner, or if it is simply one of 100 similar flags that flew during the Golden Age of Piracy. But the tourists who visit the museum will stand before the case and take photographs, and the guides will tell the story of the crimson flag and the man who ruled by fear until his own symbol betrayed him. And the flag, what remains of it, hangs silent in its glass prison, neither confirming nor denying the legends that have grown around it like coral upon a sunken anchor. It is simply a piece of cloth, faded and fragile, a relic of violence and ambition, and the sea's eternal indifference to human suffering. But to those who know the stories, it is something more, a reminder that even the most fearsome pirate is still a mortal man, and that the symbols we create to inspire terror can just as easily become the instruments of our destruction. The crimson flag betrayed its master not through any magic or curse, but through the simple truth that men cannot be held by fear alone. Loyalty purchased with terror is loyalty that will vanish the moment a better offer appears, and a flag is only as powerful as the men who choose to follow it. The Scarlet Pirate learned this lesson too late, when the white pennant rose above his ship and his crew turned their weapons upon him, and in that moment the crimson flag ceased to be a symbol of power and became instead a symbol of betrayal, a blood-red shroud for a dead man's ambitions. The fragment in the Havana Museum collects dust, and the stories fade with each generation, but the lesson remains. In the lawless waters of the Caribbean, where might made right and mercy was a luxury few could afford, even the most fearsome reputation could be undone by a single act of treachery. The flag that had scattered merchant convoys and emptied coastal towns became the very banner under which its owner was destroyed, struck down not by naval cannons or royal justice, but by the hands of men who had once sworn to follow him unto death. Some nights, when the curator locks the museum doors and the lights dim in the exhibition halls, he swears he can feel a coldness emanating from the case that holds the crimson fragment. He tells himself it is merely the air conditioning, or perhaps a draught from the old building's many cracks and crevices, but sometimes he wonders if the scrap of silk remembers what it once was, when it flew proud and terrible above a pirate ship and sent tremors of fear through every vessel that sighted it upon the horizon. The sea holds many secrets, and the dead keep their counsel, and the truth of the Scarlet Pirate's final days may never be fully known. But the fragment of crimson silk remains, a tattered remnant of an age when men could carve kingdoms from violence and greed, and when a single flag could mean the difference between life and death, fortune and ruin, loyalty and betrayal.